do their best to serve the interest of stakeholders. We know that in reality there are lots of agency problems. But this is an assumption that they're making. The third assumption is that no firm ever goes bankrupt, which means no bankruptcy cost. They are not taking into consideration bankruptcy cost. And fourth one, equity investors are honest with lenders. There is no subterfuge or attempt to find loopholes in loan agreements. Here we are saying that there is no conflict of interest between debt holders and stockholders. Okay. So again, we are reducing the conflicts of interest and the agency costs between the different agents. Yeah. I don't know why it's off. So as I said, these are assumptions. They can seem unrealistic, but this is usually what theories are about and models are about. We try to make simplistic assumptions to simplify the reality, to come up with some interesting ideas, at least a framework from where to start. And then from there we can add more complexity into our model. So this is basically the purpose of any model, and as I said, even though it seems very simplistic and unrealistic, these guys won a Nobel Prize for this work, which means that they built something new, a framework, and from this framework people started building up and coming up with more ideas, and that led to what we know now about capital structure and its impact and the factors that matter, etc. Okay, so we start with something very simple, but this is what helps building knowledge and learning.
Are you gonna talk about the WACC at some point?
Yeah, briefly now.
Oh, okay.
Briefly. So these are the assumptions. As I said, the last one I think I didn't mention. Firms know their future financing needs with certainty, so there is no uncertainty about the future, which means we don't really worry or care about the future opportunities and financial flexibility. Okay, so this reduces the cost of financial flexibility as well. So the question is, what happens to the trade-off between debt and equity under these assumptions, and how much should a firm borrow? If we comply with these assumptions, if we assume that there is no bankruptcy cost, agency cost, no taxes, etc., the answer of Modigliani Miller is that, as I told you before, the capital structure is irrelevant, which means it doesn't matter how much you borrow. At the end of the day, what matters is what you invest in, the quality of your investment, the quality of your assets. If you are launching a new product, the quality of this new investment, etc. So this is what Modigliani Miller say, and of course it's not just they didn't just say it, they demonstrated it, they proved it under these assumptions. There is a model and we can show how it works. And the idea here, how we can reach this conclusion, also what you mentioned, the WACC, is that the cost of capital, what they show actually is that under these assumptions, the cost of capital will not change with leverage. This is what we represent here graphically. The weighted average cost of capital is this line, and under Modigliani Miller assumptions, you can see that whether you have more debt or less debt will not affect the cost at which you finance your investments. Okay? Why? Again, I'm not showing you the model, but the idea is that when you borrow more, what will happen? There are two components in the cost of capital. What do you mean by cost of capital? How much does it cost to raise money, whether it's debt or equity? So the cost of capital is a combination of two things: the cost of debt and The cost of equity.
Is it true the cost of the equity is usually more than the cost of
Exactly, that's a very good
40%?
point. Exactly. Which one is higher usually when we raise equity or when we raise debt? Which one costs more?
Equity.
Equity costs more. Sometimes when I ask this question, it's not that straightforward for people to say that it's equity. Some people think that equity is free because it's money brought by the owners, but these owners expect a return in exchange, okay? So yes, when you borrow money, you have to pay interest, but when investors or shareholders bring equity, they also expect to get a return. So which one is higher, the interest you pay for debt or the return you offer for your shareholders? The return you offer for your shareholders because they are taking a higher risk. And here we go back to the idea of residual claim versus fixed claim. The risk is higher because shareholders have a residual claim while debt holders have a fixed claim, okay? So this is why the cost of equity, as you said, is higher than the cost of debt. That's always the case. Equity holders require more to accept to bring money. If I go and buy a stock in Dubai financial market, I will maybe do it if I think I can earn maybe, I don't know, 10, 15, 20%, right? I'm being very optimistic here, but that's what would be my expectation. If I lend money, if I'm a
40%.
banker,
40%.
you are being overly optimistic if you're saying 40%. Yeah, I wish I could earn 40% in a year, but this is not, it can happen of course, but on average, and I have some statistics also over a long period of time, on average in the stock market, you will not have 40%. So actually if a bank lends money or if you buy a bond in the market, the interest you would have would be maybe, I don't know, 4, 5, 6%, not more. Okay? So here you see the difference between the cost of debt and the cost of equity. Now, they are different, but at the end of the day, what we are looking at is the average, is what we call the weighted average cost of capital, the WACC. It's an average between these two costs, weighted by the proportion of debt and the proportion of equity. So if we take a weighted average, and actually what happens is that the cost of equity will increase with leverage. Why does it increase with leverage, the cost of equity? The more debt you have, the higher the cost of equity will be. What is the reason for that?
Because the company is too leveraged now. It has.
It's a matter of risk, yes.
Cannot pay cash
the cost
dividends.
of equity will increase with leverage because of a higher risk, and the cost of debt also will increase. Okay, if a bank, when the bank lends money and sees that you already have very high leverage, the cost will increase. Of course, it will not increase at the beginning. You can see that here it's quite flat, but it increases when you reach a certain critical point where your leverage becomes very high, okay? But on average, because it's weighted by the proportions, on average, the average will remain constant. That's what Modigliani here showed. And we can again demonstrate it, okay? Because you have a cost that is higher with a proportion that is lower, and the cost that is lower with the proportion that is higher. So on average, it remains the same, under the assumptions we have mentioned. If the cost of capital remains the same, the value of the firm will also remain the same, regardless of how you finance the assets. Why? Because from where we get this, actually, what is the value of the firm? This is important also, it's an important idea in finance. In finance, valuation is based on what? When you want to value something, a stock, a project, a firm, what do you do usually? How do you value a project, for example? You mentioned last time that the tool we
The
use.
income statement, the financial statement.
Yeah, but what do you
يعني
do
هذا
technically? Exactly, what do you do?
You discount the future cash flows.
Exactly, you discount future cash flows. So you try to estimate, to project what will be the future cash flows of the project. For example, I have a project over 10 years. I will try to, based on projected financial statements, etc., pro forma financial statements, etc., I will try to have some estimates of my cash flows for the year 1, 2, 3, until 10, and then I will discount them back to the present, and this will be the value today of my project. Okay? So what do we use to discount these cash flows? When we discount the cash flows of a project, what rate do we use?
The WACC.
The weighted average cost of capital. Remember yesterday when we talked about the hurdle rate, I told you that this is something that this is maybe a very difficult input to get when we make investment decisions, and it's very important because it depends on the riskiness of the cash flows, etc. So if you take two projects, what makes the difference between two projects are the cash flows, but also how risky they are. Okay? Two projects may generate exactly the same cash flows, expected cash flows, what you think would be the cash flows. But one project may have more uncertainty than the other project. Okay? So which one would be worth more? Even if they generate the same cash flows, because they don't have the same risk, the one that has less risk would be valued higher, right? So it's not only the cash flow that matters, it's also the discount rate we use, which takes into consideration the riskiness of the cash flows. And the discount rate we use in finance, what we call the hurdle rate, what we expect. What do we expect to earn actually at a minimum? What's the minimum we would expect to earn? Is what it costs us to raise capital, right? So what we use as discount rate is the weighted average cost of capital to discount all our cash flows. So if my weighted average cost of capital is the same, regardless of whether I have more debt or less debt, the value will also be the same. And that's what Modigliani and Miller are saying. They're saying if under these assumptions, the cost of capital doesn't change, so the value doesn't change. Okay? So this is basically the idea. Of course, it takes me a few, maybe 2 or 3 weeks with the undergraduate students to go through Modigliani Miller theory. It is quite, of course, more detailed than that, but this is the idea. Now, all this is under certain assumptions again, but again we can introduce, for example, if we introduce taxes here, what will happen? Let's say we said there is no taxation, but if there is taxes, what will happen? The conclusion of Modigliani and Miller will be no more valid, right? So what will happen? Since taxes represent a benefit of having debt, right? We said it's a tax benefit. So what do you think will happen when we increase the amount of debt? The value or the cost will increase or decrease?
It will go down.
It will go down. The cost will go down, the value will go up. Okay? So the more debt you have, the higher the value of the firm. So in this case, if we are under this assumption, if we say that there is taxes and we keep everything the same, we only change the fact that there is taxes. We are saying now that value increases with debt, right? So what would be then
The taxes will
the
go up.
optimal level of debt that we should have? Here we are saying it doesn't matter. I should not care about how much debt I should have, right?
Yeah.
If now I'm saying that by having taxes, the value will increase, how much debt should we have as a business? Should we have more debt or less debt, first of all?
More.
More,
Yeah.
since the company becomes more valuable with debt. But how much more? Well, theoretically, again, if we just introduce taxes, the optimal debt ratio would become 100%. The more debt, the better it is. The more debt, the better it is. So the limit is 100%. We know that this is not realistic again. So there is something wrong. This is Modigliani Miller with taxes. They came up with this second model, but we know that this is not correct. So actually, the problem comes from the fact that we are taking into consideration a benefit, which is taxes, but we are ignoring all the costs. Bankruptcy cost, agency cost, etc.
Right.
So what other people came up after and did, they said, okay, we have taxes on one hand, we have costs on the other hand. So let's model these costs and see how the debt ratio will affect the value if we take into consideration the cost. And there, this is where it becomes interesting, because this is what we have really in practice. There is a trade-off. There is a point where either you have more benefit than cost or more cost than benefit. So it's like you're having a benefit that exceeds the cost. At some point they become equal, and then the cost becomes more important. So the value goes up, reaches a certain maximum, and then starts going down. So this is the optimal point that we should find. What is the optimal point that gives me the trade-off between benefit and cost? Okay? So this was just a summary of capital structure theory and what we know about it. I think we went through this already. Yeah, just one thing to say. This is a whole family of models that belong to what we call the trade-off theory. It's the trade-off between, again, the benefit and the cost that we have. There is another idea that has been also picked by researchers, and they presented models related to it. This idea is more practical. It's based on observation. We observe also that managers who decide on the level of debt have a hierarchy in their mind. Okay? So if you want to decide on what source of financing you will use first, what would be the first source of financing that managers would use? Is it debt? Is it equity?
Debt.
Is it internal cash?
Internal cash.
So first, internal cash. If I have cash, I should use the cash first. The internal cash. Why? Because it's less costly. Because it costs nothing to use your internal cash in terms of logistics cost, no? Because whenever you raise money from outside, there is a cost. And then, second choice, debt or equity?
Debt.
Debt. And last choice is equity. And again, you can think in terms of cost, from least costly to most costly. So this is what we call the pecking order theory is about. There is a hierarchy, there is an order under which we go and raise money in the market, or from internally or in the market actually. So this is also confirmed through some surveys. As you can see, when we ask people what are the main sources of financing that they would use first, they would start by ranking them from first to last by the retained earnings, so internal financing, and then debt, and then convertible debt, which is the hybrid type of security, and then equity, and then preferred stock and convertible preferred. These are more like sophisticated instruments. Yes, you wanted to add something?
Can you elaborate more about the internal cash?
Yes. So
How can I generate, or if I don't have a cash?
if you don't have cash, you have no other choice than go outside and borrow money or raise equity.
What about
But what we are saying here is, if a company is already generating cash, it will use this cash first, and then go and borrow money, and then go and issue stock. Okay? This is the idea, and this is what we observe. This is what happens. Okay? You are already having cash. Why would you go and borrow money if you have already the cash internally? Do you think it is really common for companies to go and distribute the cash to the shareholders and then at the same time go and borrow money to invest in a new investment? It can happen, but it's less common. Usually we invest the cash that we have for future growth, because this is what will generate, what will create value for the future. And then if we run out of cash, we don't have enough, or maybe we have so many good projects that are worth investing in, then we will go and borrow, and we will go and issue new stock. Okay? Does it answer your question?
Yeah. What about cutting the expenses? Like if I have too many expenses in the company,
How does
trying
it
to
relate to this?
I'm trying to reduce the budget, maybe.
Yeah?
And these kind of savings will generate
Cash.
cash.
Yes.
So cutting the expenses sometimes, like the employees or process?
Yes, it depends, because cutting expenses, of course, like it's part of the efficiency also to be operating at a lower expense level, but it should not be undermine your business, because
Of
if
course,
it's
yes,
cutting
yes.
expenses to maximize the profit, like what we said last
Cannot
time,
sacrifice, yeah.
well, if you fire people, yes, you will cut expenses, but you will have maybe less productivity, or you will have less efficiency. Okay, it's not always the case, but I'm saying cutting expenses, yes, if it's to improve efficiency, but if it's just to improve your profit, then it's not the right thing to do. And again, the good example here is that you can cut expenses by reducing your research and development, which undermines your future, basically. If you don't do research and development now, how are you going to grow in the future? How are you going to be competitive and innovative, etc.?
You outsource the research, outsource R&D.
Outsource R&D, yeah.
I
So
thought you-
outsourcing is another decision, because outsourcing, it doesn't mean you remove the expense. Outsourcing is an expense also. You have to pay for it, right?
You don't want to also risk losing the knowledge.
Yeah, there is other issues related to outsourcing. The discussion is then at a different level, let's say. It becomes an operating leverage, actually, outsourcing. It's an operating leverage type of issue, not the financial leverage. Here we're talking about financial leverage. Outsourcing versus doing it in-house is an operating leverage, because it depends also on the uncertainty of your revenues, etc.
Sometimes companies are for a long time. They just do cuts in R&D temporarily until they
Yes.
improve on business.
Well, of course, if they are running out of cash. But here we are talking about a company that needs funding for future projects. So it means that the company is doing well, it's growing, it's having good opportunities of investment. But we are talking about where to get the money, whether we should use our internal cash if we have any retained earnings, or borrow, or issue equity. So the theory is telling us the story, but in practice we see that there is a hierarchy again. We start first with our internal cash, and of course this contradicts what the theory says, because if you have preference, if you have an order of preference, then it's not perfectly consistent with what Modigliani Miller said. This is the idea. So there are two families of models, if you want, the trade-off and the pecking order, where you pick first the internal cash, and then you go to debt, and then you go to equity. Okay, and this is again confirmed with some data. This is the number. These are the numbers from U.S. firms over time. You can see that the biggest proportion of financing is coming from. This is the percentage of financing from different sources. The biggest part is coming from internal financing, and this is consistent over years, even higher now over the last decade.
So this is like
follow. So this is the biggest one is internal financing, and then the blue one is debt, and the smallest one is equity.
which is an indicator that companies have cash within
Yeah,
the management.
I mean, it's a percentage of their, so if they generate enough cash, they would use first their cash, and then the debt, and then the equity. Yes. If you don't have cash, you cannot invest anyway, right? Okay, so these are the two perspectives as I explained, the trade-off and the pecking order. Let's not spend too much time here. Now I will go quickly through some stylized facts. Stylized facts means, okay, these are what the theories are telling us. Let's see now really what we observe empirically, and from there you will get a unified model that takes into account both perspectives, basically. So this is what people identify through empirical work, because we have the theory, but then we try also to check it empirically by looking at samples of companies in, all over the world, etc., US, and then all over the world. So the first fact is that over long periods of time, aggregate leverage is stationary, which means it doesn't change a lot. If you take a long period of time and you look at at the aggregate level, the amount of leverage, it doesn't change a lot over time. So this kind of, there is a persistence in the level of leverage, and this persistence places important limit on theory because it contradicts what the theory is saying, right? If leverage doesn't change, it means that what the trade-off theory and what the pecking order theory are telling us is not completely true. Second fact is that there is a core set of 6 reliable factors that are correlated, and we will see them also for GCC firms here through some other studies later. So there is 6 variables or 6 factors that matters when it comes to leverage. We look at a cross section, which means we take a big amount of companies and we see what are the factors that matter across, okay? For on average for all these companies, what are the factors that matter? And we found these are again empirical facts. So it's proven statistically with some very good papers and results. So they find that, for instance, tangibility is positively related to leverage. What does it mean tangibility? Is how tangible your assets are. Okay? So tangible means whether you have more like physical assets or more intangible. So the more tangible assets you have, the more debt you will have. This is something we would expect, right?
Yeah.
Because if you are in a business where most of your assets are intangible, who's gonna lend you money anyway? It's less easy to borrow money when you have intangible assets, because usually borrowers or lenders require a certain amount of collateral. Okay, so if you have mostly intangible assets, you will not be able to borrow a lot of money, basically. The second factor is the log of assets. Log of assets here is a measure we use in finance for the size.
Yeah.
It measures
Number.
the size of the company. So it tells you that the bigger the company, the higher the leverage. This is also something we would expect. Small companies borrow less than large companies usually, and they have less access to debt also. Okay, so the size matters, the tangibility of the assets matter. What is the second one? The third one, sorry. Yeah, expected inflation has also a positive impact on leverage. This is at the macro level. Now, negative effect, we have a negative effect of market to book and profits. So the more profitable the company, the less it will borrow. Why? Because if it's profitable, it will generate more cash, so it will borrow less, basically. Yeah. The more you generate cash, the less you borrow. And the market to book ratio, it's a measure of growth versus value, actually. So the more growth you have, the less you will borrow here. So these are some facts again, and we will contrast them to what we observe in the region. This is again another fact. Firms frequently adjust their debt, and the financing deficit plays a role in these decisions. So what is financial deficit? Financial deficit is the gap of financing we have compared to the internal cash. So the idea again is that you use your internal cash first, and if it's not enough, then you go and you borrow it. So we try to measure this gap, and we'll see if it's linked to the decision or not. So is it really, in other words, is the decision to borrow money linked to the deficit or not? Or is it independent from the deficit? Maybe we have the cash, as we discussed before, and we still want to borrow it. So this is what we try to show here. And actually, the answer is yes, there is a link between financial deficit and financing through leverage. But what the evidence shows is that the other factors that you mentioned are more important than the financing deficit. So in terms of importance, economic importance, the tangibility of the size, the book to market and profitability, etc., matter more than the deficit itself. Okay, so it's not really the most important factor. And the fourth one is about market conditions. We can wonder also, some people try to see whether the environment, the market environment, the macroeconomic situation will affect the leverage or not. So, for example, when the economy is going through some bad conditions, we will borrow less. When it's doing well, we will borrow more or not. So it's like the business cycle, the effect of business cycle on the leverage. And the evidence is that market conditions have some effect, but again, it's not that important in terms of magnitude and durability. These effects don't persist a long time, and they are not that important. So it seems that what matters more are the characteristics of the business itself in terms of tangibility, size, etc., rather than the economic environment or the economic conditions. Okay? So this is again supported by so many studies. I have here listed some references. Number 5, announcements of corporate debt issues and debt repurchases have little, if any, effect on the market value of the firm. So when the company announces that it will issue new debt or it will repurchase debt, which means retire the debt or take new debt, does it have an effect on the value of the firm? This is again consistent with the idea of we're trying here to check whether what Modigliani Miller are saying makes sense or not, right? Is there a link between the value and the amount of debt we have? And the evidence is that there is an effect, but it's quite small. Okay? So it's kind of going consistently with Modigliani Miller idea here. Number 5, now we do the same with equity. Our equity issues and equity repurchases linked to a change in value. So if we issue, do we have an increase or a decrease in the market value when we issue stock or when we retire stock, which means repurchase stock? I think we mentioned this last time for repurchases. We said that repurchases are accompanied with an increase in the value. So when you remember the reason why?
No, when they repurchase the stock, their value, the stock value goes up,
yes,
but the value of the outstanding stocks go down. The value of the firm, the value of the firm will...
No, it's an increase in the market value of the firm that happens. Because when we say the stock value goes up, what does it mean? It means the stock price goes up. So the value of the whole equity of the firm goes up, which means also the value of the firm goes up, right?
But
remember the reason why we said this?
Because it will create an impression.
First of all, the signal you send, and also because, as I said, the managers, they will repurchase the stock if they know that it's undervalued. So when we repurchase undervalued stock, the price goes up, basically.
Yeah, the value per stock will go up, but the total value of the firm,
how is it gonna go
because
down if the stock goes up?
Yeah, but
imagine Amal stock tomorrow goes up, the value of the whole firm will go up.
Yeah,
right?
but the Ammar already repurchased a lot of their stocks, for example.
You mean in terms of total amount?
Yes.
Yeah, in terms of percentage of equity, it's not the value.
Yeah.
It's the percentage of equity versus it's the mix between debt and equity. Percentage of equity will go down, the percentage of debt will go up, of course, if you retire some equity and you keep the debt the same. Yes, that's true, but in terms of value, it goes up. Okay? You see what I mean? Yeah. So this is the last one, I think, that we wanted to talk about. So all these are facts that have been documented in the literature empirically by some serious studies, and they have been also supported by some surveys that, like the ones I mentioned already, and and there is one by Graham and Harvey also that is, this is the one I mentioned before actually, the results of Graham and Harvey 2001. And these are some findings, related findings for GCC markets. So at least what I found, there are other studies, but I try to put the most important ones. So the first paper by Al-Wajmi, Hussein and Al-Salah 2009, they show that firms' capital structure in the region here is positively affected by profitability, size, growth opportunities, and institutional ownership. And negatively impacted by tangibility, government ownership, family ownership, business risk, dividend payment, and liquidity. So here already we find some contradiction with the global results. We don't have exactly the same result. But I think that this has been contradicted after by other studies, which the problem always when we do GCC related research like cross-sectional with a panel of firms is the limitation in terms of data. So like a study in 2009, they didn't have enough, I think, data points to be able to have very good results. But the studies that came later were able to have a longer period of time with a bigger sample basically. Yeah? So I wouldn't, I kind of put a question mark on the main findings of this first study that was contradicted. Here, for example, you can see that leverage ratios are negatively related to liquidity, tangibility, and profitability. So already profitability here turns negative. And they are positively and significantly related to firm size, which confirms the international evidence as well. So here, how would we explain, for example, the fact that capital structure is negatively related to government ownership? Because this is what maybe is more specific to the region here, right? If we have more government ownership, we would rely less on debt, basically. So companies that have government ownership will have less debt, right? This is something we would expect. Now, in terms of tangibility, why it would be negatively impacted by tangibility? Maybe because of the nature of business here also. Like, if you think of the most important assets here, I think they are related to oil and gas, and oil and gas companies have tangible assets, but at the same time, these are not companies that would go and borrow money, right? Because of the amount of cash that they generate. So it is maybe one of the explanations.
Intellectual art, intellectual assets and art, and this is will get negatively affected.
That's what we expect. That's the international evidence.
Yes.
But here in GCC, what we are seeing is that tangibility is negatively related to leverage. So it's like the more tangible assets you have, the less leverage you have, which is in contradiction with the international evidence. Because I think that big firms here who have tangible assets are either government-owned firms or family businesses that do not borrow a lot of money. And maybe here the taxation is important also because there is no taxation, the benefit of taxation is not there. So this reduces overall the amount of leverage. I don't know if I say it somewhere here, it's been documented also that in the region, on average, we have a lower leverage than the international level, and this is consistent with the idea of tax benefit. Since there is no tax benefit, there is less incentive for leverage, basically. Another study that is more recent, and this has been done by two of our colleagues, Belkhir and Belkhir left, but Akhtar Maghaira is still our colleague. They find a strong positive impact of firm size and asset tangibility. Here we have more consistent result because it's in 2016, so we cover a bigger panel of firms, and the negative impact of profitability and growth opportunities on leverage. So these results are more consistent with the international evidence, and maybe because also back up to 2016, the context, the economic context of the region has changed also. It's not the same as before maybe 2008, 2009, and now up to 2000, maybe 15, 16, it's a different economic context. So there is a shift, if you want, in the sign of the results here. The new thing that they did in their paper, Belkhir, Maghayra, and Wartani, is that they introduced also the quality of institutions. I told you last time that one of the differences between research we do on developed market and research we do on emerging markets is that in emerging markets we will be taking into consideration other aspects like the institutional environment and the culture and what we call actually the formal and informal institutions. Because we know that they differ a lot from developed countries and they will have a bigger impact here. For example, the role of institutions here is very important. The regulations will be very important in the amount of leverage that we may have. So what they show is that better institutional quality leads firms to use more debt. So firms will be more comfortable using more debt if the quality of institutions is better. Okay? This is the conclusion, and this is something we would expect because, again, the debt, one of the costs related to debt is bankruptcy costs. And if there is a fear of the institutional environment, it will increase those costs, both the agency costs and the bankruptcy costs. When the institutional environment is not favorable, costs will increase. So it will be, of course, maybe preventing firms from borrowing money, while if the institutional environment is better, the cost will be less and there will be more incentive for firms to borrow money. So this is, these are the main findings for the GCC. Now, talking about, we discussed also last class the payout policy. So I will go quickly through some facts also related to payout policy. Remember that the payout policy is about...
It was mentioned here the dividend policy is negatively influenced in the GCC country.
You mean in the slides to come,
slide,
yes?
Yeah.
In the previous.
In the previous slide, and I wanted to know exactly how.
So it's not the dividend, it's you're talking about the leverage.
The leverage.
Financing, yes.
So the dividend policy, the leverage,
yes,
will negatively affect the dividend policy here in GCC. This is what I wanted to ask you.
Is it? We're talking about the last slide here. Maybe I didn't go through it. Here? Let's see.
No.
The first one,
Yes.
the dividend payment. Yeah. So it says that the capital structure is negatively impacted by dividend payment, which means that the more we pay dividends, the less we borrow. Okay? The more we pay dividend, the less we borrow. What is the reason for that? Honestly, there is nothing in the mainstream, let's say, theoretical and empirical results that would confirm this statement. These are empirical facts. These are facts that were drawn empirically by these studies. And again, if there is more, it's like, I wouldn't agree, first of all, with this link at the first place. Yes, dividend policy and financing policies are related, because if you pay more dividends, sometimes it's true that here in the region, sometimes companies will pay dividend and borrow money, so you would see a positive link, which means we will use the cash to please our, and we will talk about it in a moment when we will see the payout policy. It's like we
Yeah,
will
but
have
they-
tendency to pay the
Yeah.
cash to please our shareholders, because shareholders will feel more comfortable with companies that pay dividends.
ما في حد بعد.
You pay dividends, yeah. Recently, yes, but the evidence shows that again, when you have a weak institutional environment, the weaker the institutional environment, the more dividends companies will pay to kind of compensate for this. So it's like a reward for investing in stocks in a weaker institutional environment. Because the opposite of dividend is what? The opposite of dividend is aiming for capital gains. So you invest. There are two types of investors. There are investors who invest to earn dividends, and investors who invest to get capital gains. Okay?
To sell it.
To sell later and make a profit. So usually there are two different clienteles for these different types of dividend policies. What are the clienteles? If we think of, for example, who are the people who would prefer dividends versus who would prefer capital gains? They are usually not the same people, right? So can you classify them? What do you think?
Long term versus short term.
This long term versus short term, it's more income oriented versus, as you said, long term investment oriented.
Investment
So, for example, who would be more income oriented? Who wants to receive an income every month or every year and not worry a lot about long term? Versus if we compare in terms of age, for example, what do you think? Young people would be more
Sure.
income or long term? And
Yeah.
what about old people? Yeah?
Old people long term.
Old people? It's the opposite actually.
Old
Yes.
people.
Because old people, let's say a retired person. A retired person doesn't care about capital gains. A retired person wants to secure an income, right? He or she cares about an income every month or every year.
Of course.
They don't care about long term. What is the long term for an old people person? There is no
Oh,
long
yeah.
term. While a young person, if I am a young professional, I will be saving money and saving for my retirement or saving for my kids' education, or so I will be more oriented towards capital gains. Okay, so the age is one thing. The wealth also, you have different clienteles depending on how wealthy you are, because again here taxation is important, especially in markets where there are taxes, because actually what happens is that capital gains are taxed at a lower rate compared to dividends. So if you are wealthy, you belong to a tax bracket that is high, so you will not want a lot of dividend. If you are less wealthy, you belong to a lower tax bracket, maybe your tax bracket is very low, and in this case you would welcome dividends rather than capital gains, you see? So it's also related to the type of investor, wealthy versus less wealthy, or old versus young, etc., etc. So there is a link between dividend policy and financing policy, but it's not a straightforward link. We cannot say there is a positive or negative relation, because we will see when we talk about dividends now that it is quite complex. There are clientele effects, there are different categories of investors for different types of dividend policies, etc., etc. In terms of, if we think of it in terms of cash, again, if you have the cash you distribute as dividends, we would expect that it means that you don't have opportunities of growth. So this is maybe the explanation. If you don't have opportunities of growth, you will not borrow money then. That's maybe what explains the negative. Okay? Now, let's go quickly through the dividend policy or payout policy. Again, in the large picture or in the big picture, it's the last type of decision where we decide how much dividend, whether or not we should pay dividend, and how much dividend, and what type of payout. Also, I explained, for those who were not here last time, I explained that there are two ways to pay out, which means to give back the money to the owners of the business. How do we give them back the money? Either by giving them dividends, it could be cash or stock dividend or in-kind dividends, etc. Or we can repurchase their shares. It's also one way to give them back their money, right? If you repurchase their shares, you are giving them the cash. So these are the two ways of paying out the shareholders, and the idea here or the question is, what is best? What maximizes the value for the shareholders? When do we give dividends? When we don't, etc. And there is again no straightforward answer. Same as like for the capital structure, the problem is more complex than what we think. There are theories, there are some stylized facts and empirical facts that contradict somehow these theories, so it is quite complex. And again, I told you last time, the more complexity we have, the better it is for research, because it means that there is always unanswered questions and there is still things we want to understand and we want to explain. And if you change from one country to another, one region to another, the factors will not be the same also because of the characteristics of each country. So this is the process, if you want, very quickly. We have cash flows, we generate cash flows. Part of these cash flows will go to pay our debt, and part will go for equity investors. So the money that goes back to the equity investors, it can go back through two channels. Either it is reinvested in the business because it's their business at the end of the day, it's their money, or it is made available for them through dividend distribution, which is the cash that is paid out, or held back by the company. So when we pay out our stockholders, we have stock buybacks, as I said, buybacks or stock repurchases, or dividends. Okay, so this is the idea. So the idea now is, when do we hold the money back? When we have
This is the same. The cash held back by the company because of reinvestment.
Exactly. We will hold the money back if we have good opportunities of investment. Otherwise, it's better to give the money back to the shareholders and let them do whatever they want with it. If you are not able to offer them as a business good opportunities of investment that will, let's say I'm a shareholder and I expect 12% out of my money. I am giving you my money to get at least 12%. So either you make sure that you have projects that will generate for me my 12%, on average, of course, expected again, there is nothing sure in finance. Or if you don't think you can do this, if you don't have enough growth, enough projects, there are no opportunities, maybe the market is not doing well, whatever, then it's better to give me the money and I will get the 12% elsewhere, okay? Because I consider that for this level of risk, that's what I deserve. I deserve 12%, okay? This is the idea. The idea is that companies will give the dividend if they don't have enough opportunities inside the business. If they have good opportunities, if they are growing very fast, and that's why, for example, for many years, companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, who have been growing like with the huge rates, etc., they never distributed dividends for many years. For many years. There could be other reasons also, but one of the reasons is that you have great opportunities of growth. If your business is growing very fast, why would you take out the cash and spoil it somewhere else, right? So this is the idea, which is correct, but what we observe in real world or in the real market is not always consistent with this idea. Because if this was the case, what we will have? We will have companies that will distribute dividends. The dividends will change a lot from one year to another, depending on the market condition, depending on the growth opportunities, depending on the profitability, etc. But do we have this? Do you think that dividends vary a lot from one year to another? No. Usually, we say that dividends are sticky, which means we try to keep them at the same level or increase them little by little. Are earnings sticky? Are profits sticky? No. We know that there is more uncertainty. Earnings and profits fluctuate a lot, but dividends tend to be sticky. So what we do in research again is we try to understand the stickiness. Why? What explains this? Why we don't simply stick to this idea and say if we have the cash, let's see if we give it back or not, depending on the opportunities of investment. This is not happening for many, many reasons, and that's what we talk about here. I will try to go through it quickly. So two dominant factors actually explain this or tend to drive dividend policy around the world. The first one is inertia. Inertia explains the stickiness. So inertia means that we don't want to move. We are inert. We don't move. We want to keep the same type of policy. And the second one is the me tooism. Me tooism means me too. If you are able to give dividends to your shareholders, I am also able to do the same. It's again like trying to see what other peers are doing and do the same, okay? So that you don't lose your clientele in terms of investors. So these are two things that we observe when it comes to dividend distributions. Here are some numbers that clearly illustrate this. The blue stick is the increase in dividends. The red one is no change, and the purple one is the decrease. So it tells you the percentage,
No change.
yeah, of companies that stick to the same dividend versus increase versus decrease. The lowest proportion is decrease. So it means that companies tend not really avoid as much as possible decreasing their dividend. Does it mean that they always keep having increasing profits? No. But they try to not decrease their dividends as much as possible. They try to keep them the same or increase them if it's possible. Okay. And when they increase little by little. Even if this year we made huge profits compared to last year, we will increase our dividend by a little amount. Why? Because if this year you make a huge profit and you give a huge dividend, you raise the expectation of the investors. So that's why we don't like doing it. Or we would go, if we have a huge profit and a lot of cash, what we would do then, we would go and repurchase the stock. Because that's one shot. We repurchase and that's it. There is no expectation after it. While if you give a dividend, then people will expect the same next year, otherwise they will be disappointed and the stock price will go down. Okay, so this is what we observe. Another proof of it is something interesting also that happened during 2008 crisis. Imagine like last quarter of 2008 when things went really crazy, the worst quarter during which the crisis happened. And what do we have here? The number of companies of the Standard & Poor's 500, this is the main index in US, the number of companies that increase their dividend versus initiate versus decrease versus suspend their dividends. You see from 2007 to the last quarter of 2008. Last quarter of 2008, worst situation ever. Most companies are still increasing their dividends, okay? These are the US listed companies that were all suffering from the crisis like tremendously. Like if you see the index itself, the S&P 500, how it went down during that quarter, and you see that these companies are still increasing their dividends, you see exactly that something is happening there. So more companies increased compared to companies that decreased their dividends or suspended them actually. So this is really striking, and this is what. Yeah, it's because they don't want to make things worse. They want to stick to their dividends so that the stock price doesn't go even lower, probably. So it's again this idea of stickiness, of inertia, that we don't want to send a signal to the market that we are decreasing our dividend. It's like, for them, this is the worst scenario, they don't want to go there, okay? Many of them, even though they are not doing well and they are losing money. Yeah, so this is again something that shows the same idea, which is actually the link between earnings and dividends. And what we see is that dividends don't follow earnings, or there is at least like a feedback effect. So it takes 2 to 3 years for dividends to adjust slightly to earnings, but it's not gonna happen every year. If this year you don't have high earning or your earnings drop, you will not see a drop in dividends. You will see it maybe in 2 or 3 years, but slightly. So this is what this graph shows. This is also the link between taxation and dividends. In 2003, this is, I think, yeah, the effect in 2003. 2003, there was an announcement of lowering the tax rate for dividends, and the impact was clearly there. And in 2012, there was also a similar effect, with the possibility of tax rates to go back to the pre-2003 level. So they decided in 2003 to drop the tax level, and in 2012 they decided to bring it up, but still 233 companies paid a huge amount of dividends because they saw actually the decrease in taxes as an opportunity here. So the link between taxes and dividends is clear also. Anyway, I want to go to the papers now because we don't have much time left. This is some global evidence. This actually shows you, and I think the chart before also, it shows you how things have changed recently. Something I talked about last time. I said that there is a tendency now for more buybacks or more stock repurchases as opposed to dividends. Companies prefer now to repurchase rather than distribute dividends. And I gave some explanations. One of them is that when you have a stock repurchase, the stock price goes up after a repurchase. Also because managers want to give a signal that the stock is undervalued, etc. And also it's explained by, again, maybe an agency problem here, because one of the way we compensate managers, their remuneration is made of stock options, okay? So because we give them stock options, they want to see the value of the stock go up. When they give dividends, when they distribute dividends, the stock price will go slightly down by the value of the dividend, so it's not interesting for them. Because with stock options, they don't receive the dividends, they will get the value, the capital gain later, okay? And they're only interested in the capital gain, they are not interested in the dividend part. That's why they are biased towards stock repurchases, and that's why we have more and more stock repurchases, because stock options are used as part of the compensation package of managers. So this is a direct effect also of the executive compensation, and there are again studies and empirical work done about it, and that shows the clear evidence, the link between the two. So again, you try to find a solution to something and you create another problem. Stock options are a solution to the problem of agency problem, right? Because we want the managers to work towards the value maximization goal. We give them stock option instead of giving them high salary or high bonuses.
But why do I give them the stock option to the managers? This is maybe it's not matching their performance, for example. Why don't I give them the performance compensation?
Because you will make them work towards this performance. You will make them try to increase the value. You want them to be performing, right? Because if they do a good job, the value of the stock will go up.
So this is kind of
if you don't give them it's an incentive, exactly. If you don't give them the right incentive, what will happen? They will serve their own interests because they want to keep their job, they want to have their private jet, they want to, so they will serve their interest and they will not really care about the value. They will not pick the right projects, they will not take risks, etc. that's so if we want to incentivize them to do a proper job, we try to link their performance to the value of the stock, basically. So if they perform well, the value of the stock will go up, they will be winning, and the shareholders will be also winning. Now, the problem with the managers is that if they give them this, they will, for example, favor stock repurchases as opposed to dividends. There's nothing wrong about it, but stock repurchases are worth it for the business. It's good if the stock is really undervalued. But imagine the stock is overvalued and the manager is repurchasing the stock simply because he wants to make it even more overvalued. Then this at some point will lead to maybe a huge drop in the prices, right? So this can have also some negative effects, and you can see that in the early 90s there were much less stock buybacks, and more dividends. And now you see the tendency, it's just the opposite. Much more stock repurchases and less dividends. Okay. And in terms of payout in general, the amount of payout is much higher as well in billions, but this is the size of the US companies that went higher also. Okay. So it shows you that there is a clear change in the trend. We pay less dividends and we do more stock repurchases, and again, there are lots of explanations for this. Globally, the trend is there, especially so in US, for instance, it's clear you have more buybacks than dividends, and in percentage also. But if you look at other countries, like for example in Canada, we also have a good proportion of buybacks. In Europe, it's starting to pick up as well, etc. It's only in Asia that it's still behind. So we still have much less stock repurchases compared to dividends. So I think there is also some research to be done there, because probably there are reasons
dividends in China.
Yeah.
69.
Yeah, you can see that in China, for example, it's not happening. We still pay a lot more dividends than we repurchase stocks. Okay, in India, it's not happening also. You see. So in the emerging markets in Latin America, we have more repurchases now, but in Asia, in India, China, the biggest countries in Asia, it's still not happening. Okay, for some reason. In Africa and Middle East, it's still also quite low, the amount of stock repurchases. So probably there are explanations there why in these countries we don't have that much stock repurchases. Okay, I'll skip this. This is just to show you how also the dividend payout policy can depend on the life cycle of the firm, what we discussed also last time. The company goes through a life cycle. We start from the startup stage, we go through some quick growth, and then we reach a point where we have a mature growth. It's like we are stagnating, and then the decline. And depending on where we are in this life cycle, of course, we will pay more or less dividends. So at the early stages, we pay less dividends, and it's when we have mature and declining growth that we pay more dividend, basically. Yeah? So more dividend is not always maybe a sign of good health. It can be also a sign of decline or a sign of maturity, basically. Yeah? Because you have cash and you don't have opportunities of growth, basically. So you start distributing this cash. It's like you are liquidating the business by doing this. Imagine if every time you have cash you repurchase stock, you end up liquidating the whole business, right? So this is also true. This is also consistent with the growth. The higher the growth rate, and this is valid for companies and countries. The more growth, the less dividend. The lower the growth, the higher the dividend, basically. Yeah? So this is also consistent with the idea of opportunities of growth and reinvestment, etc. Now, I will not go through this. You can read them later. I want to show you some facts also, empirical facts. So basically, again, Modigliani Miller, these two guys, not only they came up with the capital structure theory, but also they came up with the dividend. Yeah. So these are geniuses in finance, and again they came up with something really very original. They under certain assumptions. If we ignore taxation, if the companies pay too much in cash, they can issue new stock with no flotation cost. Because actually, if the idea is also to say, why do we prefer first to pay our, why do we prefer first to use our internal cash and then go for debt and equity? Because as I said, it's a matter of cost. So usually companies will not go and distribute their cash and go and borrow and issue equity because it will be more costly for them. So what they assumed first is saying, okay, assume that there is no cost, no flotation cost. You can issue stock with no cost. Then you are free to distribute your cash and go and raise capital from outside. So then there is an arbitrage. You can make a trade-off between distributing dividends, what we call in-house dividend, and dividend, which means the investors can also make their own dividend by buying the stock outside, actually. So anyway, what they the conclusion they reach is that dividends do not affect value again. It's like for capital structure. Under all these assumptions, there is no impact of dividends on value, which means doesn't matter how much dividend you distribute, it will not affect your value. So dividend policy and the value of the firm are disconnected, in other words. But again, it's under all these assumptions. So if we take into consideration the taxation, for example, especially the double taxation of dividend, the fact that dividends are taxed at a different rate compared to capital gains, then there is probably an impact of dividends on the value. And this is shown here. For example, you can see that the difference in the tax rates between the blue one is the dividend tax rate. Historically, it's been always higher. And the green one is the capital gains tax rate. So the higher the dividend tax rate, the less incentive you give to investors to receive dividends, especially if they are in the high tax bracket again. So here we go to the clientele effect, etc. Okay, I will skip this. I don't want to give you too many details. I will go to some evidence, as I said. So here we talked already about the clientele effect, and I told you that there are some people who prefer less dividend and some people who prefer more dividend, depending on their social characteristics, their age, etc. Yes. So this is the first reason, and these are 3 good reasons for paying dividends. So you pay dividends because there are investors that like dividends. If you want to attract this kind of investors, you'd better pay dividends. So that's one reason. The second reason is the signaling story. This is what we call the signal theory in general. It's all the signals that the company sends through this kind of policies. So the idea, again, if we start from Modigliani Miller, is the starting point is it doesn't matter for the value, but it matters in terms of signal. So then it will have an impact. It can be linked to behavioral finance as well now. So the signal here is that if you give dividends, you believe, or you give the signal to the market that you have good cash flow prospects in the future. Okay, so this is the kind of signal that we want to send, and this is one of the good reasons why we should distribute dividends. And the wealth appropriation story is the idea that dividends are a way to transfer wealth from lenders to equity investors. So it's good for equity investors and bad for lenders. So here it's a transfer of wealth from equity holders to from lenders to equity holders. These are the good reasons. We explained already the clientele effect, and it is proven with a regression. For instance, this is extracted from one of the papers. So what the paper did is they took the dividend yield, which is a measure of dividend distribution, and they regressed on the beta, which is a measure of systematic risk, the age, the income, and the differential tax rate that we talked about. And the evidence shows exactly what is expected. So the beta is a measure of risk, so the higher the risk, the lower the dividend. The age is positively linked, which means, as we said, the older people are, the more dividends we would expect to receive. The income is negative. If you are in a high income bracket, you would prefer to receive less dividend because it's going to increase your taxation. And the differential rate, which is the difference between the rate at which dividends are taxed and the rate at which the capital gains are taxed, is also negatively linked. So all this confirms basically the intuition that we talked about. Here also the reaction of the stock market to dividends when we have dividend increase versus dividend decrease. So what happens if we look here, we split it into different periods of time, from 62 to 74, 75 to 87, and 88 to 2000, just to show how things have changed over time. So what we notice is in blue, you have the impact of the positive increase, and in green, the impact of the positive dividend decrease on the stock market, on the stock price, basically. So what happens actually, as we can see, when you have an increase, that's what people expect. There is no really impact. It's already anticipated. It's already expected. But if there is a decrease in dividends, there is a more significant impact on the stock price. And that explains why companies are reluctant to decrease their dividends even during bad times. Because they know this. They feel it. They know that this is a signal they are sending to the market, and this is what's going to happen if they decrease their dividend even by a little. Okay? And the thing is that now, over time, things have changed a little bit. This reaction is becoming less important. People are becoming more rational, maybe, because it's not rational to react like this to a dividend decrease if we believe that a dividend is not something granted. It's something that should reflect, again, the opportunities of growth of the company. Okay, so there is like less dividends, dividend increases and decreases are becoming less informative in the market. Okay. This is also a survey that targets dividend policy, and we asked managers a few questions to see what they think about what matters when it comes to dividends. So for example, if a firm's dividend payout ratio affects the stock price, 61% of them said yes. So this is why they keep their dividends sticky, because they believe in this. They think that it's gonna affect their stock price. If dividend, which is in contradiction, by the way, with Modigliani Miller, who says there should be no impact on the value of the firm. Dividend payments provide a signaling device of future prospects. 52% agree with this, so they use it as a signal again. The market uses dividend announcement as information for assessing firm value. 43% think it is the case, etc., etc. So I think here the low one is investors are basically indifferent with regard to returns from dividends and capital gains. Only 6% agree with this. So they see that they have this clientele effect, that investors are not indifferent between capital gains and dividends. They have a preference. Either they prefer capital gains or they prefer dividends, and managers, they know this. They know that there is this clientele, they have to cater to this different clientele. Okay? Now when it comes to GCC findings, these are some of the main results related to dividend. Someone sent me, not here, who wants to do the papers on dividends? You are, okay. So, yeah, this is something, you will find all the summary, I think, of the most important facts in the papers you are reading, probably, because this is what the evidence is. Yeah. So, in this paper, the author investigates the determinants of dividend policies listed in GCC stock markets. They find that dividend payments are strongly and positively related to government ownership. So the more the government-owned companies will tend to pay more dividends. Do you think this is true here, for example, in UAE? Or you don't have experience with stock market investments?
Again, sorry?
So government-owned companies tend to pay more dividends here in GCC. No? Firm size and firm profitability, so these are positive impacts. The higher the size and the higher the profitability, the more dividends we have. And negatively related to the leverage ratio, so the higher the leverage, the lower the dividend here. So if this indicates that firms pay dividends with the intention of reducing the agency problem, which means the purpose of paying dividends is to reduce the agency problem and to maintain firm reputation. Okay. This is another study where the authors, this is in Oman, they found that Omani firms distribute high proportions of their income to shareholders. So it's like exceptionally high, higher than what it should be. And they find that also many firms smooth their dividends, so stickiness, they observe stickiness in the dividends, regardless of what the earnings are, so there is a stable dividend policy. And yeah, so they explain this with this substitute model, which is a combination of the models that we have seen. They find also that in countries with weak protection of shareholders and poor corporate governance, firms need to establish a good reputation by paying more dividends to shareholders. So the explanation they found to the fact that how many companies pay more dividends is probably to compensate for less shareholder protection and less weak protection of shareholders and weak corporate governance. I mean, weak, of course, compared to developed markets, this is like, these are the characteristics of some of the emerging markets, is that we have, of course, weaker institutions, weaker corporate governance, and weaker investor protection. So to compensate for this, we offer more dividends for the sake of reputation. They also find that during the financial crisis, there was no significant impact on dividend stability of many firms. So again, it did not affect the crisis, did not affect the dividend policy, and they continued paying high dividends even after the financial crisis. So the same as what we have seen.
You mean the price of the stocks of the firm itself didn't get affected?
No, it means that companies kept paying the same high dividends even during the crisis and after the crisis. Okay. So again, dividend stickiness even during crisis times. This is the same impact. Okay, we still have some time. So I mentioned also behavioral finance. And here, very quickly, with only a few slides. So as I explained to you, behavioral finance is also a hot topic because all these problems, agency problems, all these mispricing that we observe in the markets, etc., can be explained to some extent with the behavior or the sentiment of investors, of managers, basically. Yeah? So there are actually different, if we talk about behavioral corporate finance, because behavioral finance can apply to the stock market, to different topics, but if we focus on corporate finance, actually there are two approaches. The first approach is to say investors are not rational. When we say behavioral finance here, we are trying to take into consideration, as I said, the sentiment. So it means that we are not making rational decisions all the time. We are using our sentiment to make this decision. Okay? How optimistic we are, how pessimistic we are, a mix of biases, behavioral biases, etc., would explain maybe what happens in the market or what happens when we decide where to invest, etc. So there are two approaches when it comes to corporate finance, because in corporate finance we look at decisions from a corporate perspective again. Huh? First approach is to say the manager is rational, he knows what to do, but the investors outside are not. Okay? So he will take into consideration the fact that investors, I wouldn't say irrational, I would say they are less than rational. Because irrational means you do something crazy. What we observe is that investors are sometimes rational, sometimes not that rational. And this is proven through some experiments, through
This is
very
why
interesting.
we have agency problem.
Exactly. So the idea is to say investors are not rational. So as manager, when I make my decisions, I will take this into consideration. Okay? This is the first approach. Second approach is to say the managers themselves also are not rational. They are biased. They have some bias, behavioral biases, we call them. So these are the main ideas, and we try to explain things using these biases. These are some of the biases that are identified through experiments. There is a big trend now for what we call how we call it, like experimental finance. So it's like we take a lab, like a room like this, we put people and we confront them with real situations and we try to see how they react. And we give them money, etc., to see really what happens. And from there, we try to identify where they make rational decisions, where they make irrational decisions, etc. So it's very interesting, but it requires big budgets, because you have to hire people, put them in situation, create scenarios, give them money, etc., to create really the real market atmosphere. So the first bias is optimism, which tends to we tend to believe that we are always doing better than other people. For example, what is proven is that people tend to think that they will live past 80. The proportion of people that tend to think that they will live past 80 is much higher than the number of people who actually live past 80. You see what I mean? It's not a very nice example, but this is something that has been experimented. Also, it is less likely to experience negative events like being fired. Maybe there is 50% chances that we all get fired, right? Every one of us. 50% is quite high. But just to take an example, but if you ask people independently, what's the likelihood or what's the probability that you get fired, you will say 10%, 20%, right? So he always underestimates the negative events. Overconfidence. This is, for example, something also that was proven. 82% of a sample of students place themselves in the top 30% in terms of driving safety. So it means it's impossible, right? You cannot be 82% out of the top 30. So this means also overconfident. 82% think they are driving safely, while the percentage is only 30%, okay? Attribution, this also, I like this example because it's very true. It's the tendency to take greater responsibility for success than failure. This applies to managers. Managers will attribute to themselves the successes, but the failures, it's always a crisis or the market or something else. I always give this example. I like this example with students because I always tell my students, self-attribution, we call self-attribution, is when the students does great in an exam. You leave the room, you get your grade, you're happy, you say, I got an A, you're very happy about yourself, how smart you are, etc. But if you fail, El Dr. Rassabni, he failed me. They don't say, I failed, right? She failed me. This doctor failed me, but I didn't fail. But when you succeed, you never say the doctor made me succeed, right? It's, well, I got A, I'm so proud of myself. So this is exactly self-attribution. And this applies to managers a lot, because managers, they will attribute to themselves the successes, but the failures will be always someone else's mistake. It's either the market or his subordinate or his number two or whoever. So this is also something we observe. And as I said, the first approach is to say managers are rational, but not investors. So what happens in this case? For example, we look at mergers and acquisitions and investments, and we see that there is a link between mispricing and investments. There is evidence that investment is sensitive to proxies for mispricing. So it means that managers believe that there is mispricing. And when we say mispricing, what does it mean? It means overpricing or underpricing. And this is why a mispricing will persist in the market. It can only be explained with behavioral biases. Because if the market is rational, there should be no mispricing. Okay? The prices should be fair. But if we are irrational, then we could either overprice something or underprice it. And we find evidence that investment is linked to mispricing, which means that managers believe that there is mispricing because of some irrational investors, and they will try to take this opportunity in the market. This is mainly for mergers and acquisitions. It's the case. We explain this with behavioral finance. We explain, for example, the fact that acquirers are overvalued, usually that's something we observe, and they tend to create value for long-term shareholders by acquiring a fairly valued or simply less overvalued firm. Okay, so they know that they have an overvalued company. How they will create value? With an overvalued company, you cannot create value, right? You're destroying value for your shareholders. So by going and acquiring a business that is either fairly valued or less overvalued. So it's like knowing that there is something wrong in the market and trying to use it for your benefit. Yeah, exactly. Same with the market timing of mergers, with the studies that show that market level mispricing proxies and merger volume are positively correlated, which means that whenever you see that there is a lot of mispricing in the market, there will be lots of deals happening. There will be lots of mergers and acquisitions happening. So here again, it's like, again, saying the managers know that the market is irrational and they know how to time this market. Okay? So it is evidence for the existence of irrationality in the market. And there are other examples belonging to this approach, the irrational investors approach. I want to show you the other approach, which consists of saying the managers themselves now are irrational. And here, for example, in real investment, there is a study that shows that 68% of the entrepreneurs think that their startup is more likely to succeed than comparable enterprises, while only 5% believe that their odds are worse. So 68% think that they can do better than the rest. 5% only think that their odds are worse, which is statistically impossible, right? Because it's at least 50-50. And if we think of the chances of success of a startup, they are very low at the first place. So it is impossible to have this. So there is an over-optimism that characterizes entrepreneurs. And this is very important for entrepreneurial finance. When you start a new venture, a new business, your level of over-optimism can make you maybe go for wrong decisions and wrong investments because you are over-optimistic about the chances of your business succeeding, etc. Also, in the same direction, strong optimism bias in project cost forecasts, with actual costs typically more than double the estimate. So we try to estimate by how much the forecasts exceed the actual estimates and the actual numbers actually, and it's more than double. So this also shows a lot of over-optimism. And this is very important because you have all these numbers every day with all these estimates. We try to predict cash flows and we try to make decisions. And if our estimates are all biased, then the decisions would be also wrong, and it will lead probably to destroying value rather than creating value. The sensitivity of investment to cash flow is higher for the more optimistic CEOs. So here, how sensitive the investment is to cash, this would be higher. So the more cash we have, the more we will invest. Not because the investment is good, but because we are, as I said, when we have a lot of cash as a CEO, we will tend to maybe make wrong decisions because we have flexibility, we have more flexibility, we have our hands free, etc. So there is, it's proven also that there is this link between optimism and sensitivity of investment to cash flow. In terms of mergers and acquisitions, successful acquirers are optimistic and overconfident in their own valuation of deal strategies. So again, it shows that it's not just them being aware of the mispricing, but them being also over-optimistic. And the last one, they found, this is interesting also, they find that the optimistic CEOs complete more mergers. So it means that they're making decisions based on an over-optimism and not really motivated by the value creation perspective, actually. So this is for the behavioral finance. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go through the emerging market. I'll just show you one slide that you can go through by yourself. So this is just facts about emerging markets, etc. The idea, as I said, it's an emerging market, yeah. The idea, of course, the definitions vary, but yes, it is considered as emerging market. So the idea is that emerging markets are very important in size, in number of people, etc. But in terms of proportion of GDP, they remain less than the developed markets. And the reason why doing research on emerging markets is interesting is because of the specificities of these markets. So we have specific features and specific environments that can make all what we know, because most of the evidence actually that we have is coming from US. Now, to tell you the truth, I would say 80% of valid evidence we have nowadays for any problem in finance is coming from US. It's US-based evidence. Okay. So the purpose is not just to simply replicate what was done in US here, but what would be interesting is to see how the specific environment in our emerging markets can change the findings and the results that we have from the developed world. And thinking about these impacts is very interesting. So this is just a list of papers and topics that I thought about when it comes to emerging markets. These are things that have been studied and that are still
what is the last one?
Volatility transmission is how the risk, volatility is a measure of risk, is how the risk is transmitted from one country to another. For example, how, this is by the way part of my PhD dissertation, I did 2 papers on this. It's like how the shock that happens in US in terms of risk.
Political or?
It could be, now here I'm talking about market volatility, it's the measure of market risk, but it could be also political risk transmission. Yes, we can do the same methodology to see the transmission. Actually now, one very interesting topic now that is being analyzed is the transmission of what we call political uncertainty and policy uncertainty. There are measures now to measure the uncertainty of policy, monetary policy, economic policy, etc., and how this is transmitted from one country to another. For example, the policy making in US, how is it transmitted to all emerging markets? So to relate to what you said. But here what I'm talking about is the volatility of the market and how the contagion happens during crisis times or even during normal time. We talk about contagion during crisis time, we talk about transmission during normal time. There is just the volatility that goes around from one market to another, from developed to emerging, etc. So we try to see what's the direction of this transmission. We can do the same between oil and stock markets, for example, how the shocks are transmitted from one market to another. So there are lots of things that are related to this. Yeah, one last thing also I put here, if you want, if you are curious to look at it, I talked about it last time, is the cultural perspective also, the link between cultural and behavioral perspective. This is something I did recently also, and I looked, this table is extracted from my paper, this one no, but this is from my paper where I look at the highest scores for different cultural aspects. Stable because I put it because there is UAE. In my sample there is no, UAE was not there, but in this table UAE is there. And these are measures of individualism, masculinity, power distance, and uncertainty avoidance. So masculinity, a society that is more masculine is a society that is more oriented towards performance, while a society that is more feminine is a society that cares more about the well-being, the less material things, let's say. So,
Russia is. I was surprised Russia is less masculine than other countries.
Yeah.
Because they're very.
Individualism is also, actually individualism, we think about it as something negative, but what I discovered when I did this research to finish here is that individualism at the end of the day is something positive. I mean, at least from a financial perspective, the results I got are quite positive.
Innovation.
Because individualism, yeah, exactly, it is synonym of innovation. Actually, individualism is the opposite of collectivism. And a collectivist society is a society that cares more about what other people think and about the group rather than the intrinsic values and what you think. So in an individualistic society, people will care more about their own well-being and their family, etc. In a collectivist society, they will care about what people think. Okay, so they will do things not because they are right, but because of what other people think. Okay, so actually, what I found in the literature, for example, is that in more individualistic societies, you'll have more activism for environment, etc., which is surprising, but because they have, as I said, intrinsic values. They don't do things for others, they do things that they believe in, basically. So it is more complex than that, but what I did is I looked at the impact on, for example, socially responsible investment. If individualistic societies will tend to put more money in socially responsible investment or the opposite, and I found that, yes, in individualistic societies, people will tend to invest more in socially responsible in social responsibility in general. Masculinity, surprisingly or not surprisingly, it's negatively related to social responsibility. So the more feminine we are, the more we care about the society at large, etc. So yeah, I found some interesting results. Power distance is whether it's vertical or horizontal. So more hierarchy, less equality, also how does it impact the decisions, etc. So I think it's a very interesting also trend for research. Of course, people criticize these constructs, how they were measured, etc. But I think there are some interesting facts from there that we can get. Okay. We have to stop because I have colleagues who want to leave probably.